Hey there! How are y'all doing? So today I'm going to be talking about the 1990 movie Misery, directed by Rob Reiner. Now this is based on the Stephen King book of the same name, and it involves, believe it or not, a writer. And he crashes his car in the mountains in a snowstorm, and his number one fan comes to rescue him, which sounds great from the premise, but you realize pretty quick that it's not such a great thing that happened. And the rest of the movie is basically the interaction between this writer and his number one fan and how it devolves into a fit of madness and loads of insanity. So, the real big seller is these two actors, of course, and this is going to be James Caan and Kathy Bates. Now, James Caan has had a variety of roles. When I first saw him, it was in the TV show Las Vegas, and he was in charge of a casino, and that's how I got my first bit of exposure to him. And with Kathy Bates, it's hard to say where I really saw her flourish first. I still have not seen the movie Titanic. I will probably see that during this venture in my quest for the best. Even if it's not in the top 250 right now, it's still probably relatively high enough, and I know she's in that movie. And there's also another Stephen King movie that she's in called Dolores Claiborne, and I've seen that before, and that's a very solid movie, and it runs a similar thread to Misery. The main difference being that you feel more sympathetic for her in that movie as opposed to this one, because what you see here is that she's fucking crazy. There's really no better way to put it, and really she sells this performance and she sells this movie for me. So probably the freakiest thing about her is actually not when she is insane and having her bouts of that insanity and acting angry towards James Caan. It's actually when she's nice, because there are moments in this movie that you think that she could pass for a normal member of society, and then you see other times when she breaks the hell out of James Caan's legs, and you're like, oh, I guess you're not really fit to be around other people, are you? And I thought that this was a tremendous adaptation from book to movie of the book Misery itself. Not everything that Stephen King writes has translated well to film. Some infamous examples would be the Langoliers, which the monsters at the end of that movie were essentially giant meatballs. And another movie that had a lot of changes come about was The Shining. Now, I love the Stanley Kubrick version of The Shining, but Stephen King was so irritated with that version that he ended up making his own screenplay of his book. But I digress. So the characters' names here are Paul Sheldon and Annie Wilkes, and Paul Sheldon's played by James Caan, and Annie Wilkes is played by Kathy Bates. Now, when Annie pulls in Paul Sheldon into her home and helps recuperate him, she's excited. She's genuinely excited because he's her favorite writer, and he writes this character named Misery and Misery Chastain, and she has a lot of things going on. But here's the problem. Paul is in this remote place, this remote area of Colorado, for the purpose of writing his books. That's where he thinks the clearest. And he was planning on killing off this favorite, beloved character of hers. And as she keeps reading the things that he's writing, his current works in his draft, she sees that Misery is killed off, and she becomes livid and furious. And that's, well, in case you couldn't tell that she was going to be derailed off of her train, that's when her caboose goes off the tracks and really just hits the fan. So then she starts to convince him to, well, write Misery back into the story. And she also knows that this is his only copy, so she forces him to light his copy on fire, even when he tries to bluff her that he's got plenty of copies elsewhere, but she knows better because she's not totally wrong in her assessment of being his number one fan. She pays attention to a lot of the things that go on with him, and she knows his quirks. Now, this movie has a lot in common with The Silence of the Lambs, and the main things that it has in common is that there's a slow buildup of the crazy train going on here. But, the main difference is that the main female in The Silence of the Lambs is actually the protagonist in trying to fix the wrongdoing in the world, whereas the female in this tale is the villain here. And James Caan comes across some of her previous wrongdoings, and in particular, some of the infant deaths that she was responsible for, and all of these other claims in hospitals of people that she did not take very good care of. And he becomes nervous that he's never going to find anyone outside of her ever again. And you start to wonder, well, shoot, who is he ever going to encounter with? What is going to happen to him? Are his legs ever going to heal? Because when he gets pulled out of the car, his legs are in nowhere close to walking condition. So Annie is supposedly trying to get him back to solid health, but he starts to realize that something is wrong with her, that she's cuckoo, essentially. Where I find this movie takes a step further than The Silence of the Lambs, however, is that there is a slow buildup going on, but I actually feel the horror element in this movie. And there isn't a tremendous amount of blood in this movie. I'm not saying that horror movies need to have gore. And in fact, I'm more on the other end that, excess gore dilutes a movie of its horror nature. But here you get a genuine sense of tension that you may not have throughout most of the running time of The Silence of the Lambs. You really don't know what to expect from Annie Wilkes because, like I said before, she has those moments of being very nice and very sweet and being that caretaker that she claims to be. And you almost start to think, oh, well, maybe she's not so bad. And then she just dives straight off the deep end, and she's a bat out of hell. And you start to think, I don't know what to expect from her. I don't know if she's going to be really nice. I don't know if she's going to be terrifying. I don't know what to expect from her. And that's what keeps you on the edge of your seat throughout the entire running time. And of course, James Caan does make it out alive in the end. That is the good news. The movie does cut to an 18 months later, and for a moment you think that after he talks to his publisher and everything has started to come back and settle in and everything started to be fine, you start to think that Annie Wilkes is back in the same restaurant that he's sitting in that very moment. But he's just having a daydream and a nightmare, one of those kinds of things. And it turns out that someone else is his number one fan. And that's how the movie ends. And so you start to wonder to yourself, I wonder if any other number one fans are gonna come after this guy and and try to murder him, essentially. But the good news is that he ends on a high note. And fun fact of the day, his publisher in this movie turns out to be Lauren Bacall. Now, I didn't really know her as much of an actress when I was growing up because she was much before my time. But from what I know now, she's done a fair amount of work that was more recognizable, probably, I don't know, about somewhere in the 50 to 70 years ago time frame. And my first actual exposure to her and a few of these other old stars, Jack Lemmon and James Garner, was in the movie My Fellow Americans, which is this comedy movie about this whole presidential plot, and it has a few other people such as the dad from Home Alone and Dan Aykroyd. It's a fun movie. It's worth watching. But anyway, that's where I knew Lauren Bacall from, and so it was fun seeing her in this movie. kind of having the same attitude and the same sarcasm as she did in that movie. Anyhow, for me, the scariest thing about Annie Wilkes in this movie was just how convicted she was, and just how right she was, and just how much of God's will that she was following, because she believed that she was sent from God to nurse her favorite writer back to health and essentially kill him in the process because of her anger and her loss of reality towards how things should be. Now, for Stephen King, so Stephen King is honestly my favorite writer. So let's say I was a little closer to Annie Wilkes' position and I had a favorite character of mine that Stephen King wrote, right? And I finally got the chance to meet Stephen King. And he's writing his book. Now, there's talk about how he has ghostwriters, but that's not the point. Let's say he's writing his book and he just so happens to be writing his next draft of this book. And I say I'm his number one fan. And I want to know more about his books. And I want to know more about this character. And, what's he going to do? And then I find out that he's going to kill off his character. So I'd probably be a little irritated, and maybe a little more than irritated, but I would not go as far as Annie Wilkes and try to beat the shit out of him, And I think this whole book and movie of Misery has its own interesting facets anyway, because the writer's already in a state of weakness. He crashed his car off the cliff on his way out of writing his next piece. He's already on his way out, and he's already in a state of vulnerability when his number one fan comes and nurses him back to health. So that's kind of a hard game to play. It's a hard bargain to make, to try to get out of her care when you can't even walk yourself out of the door. So even though this movie was directed by Rob Reiner, I actually saw a few things from Stanley Kubrick movies that were in this. For example, you have another writer. Again, this whole Stephen King novel turned into a movie, except instead of where in The Shining, this writer goes off the deep end and just keeps typing up, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Here, when Paul Sheldon starts writing, he just writes this one continuous string of fuck, 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 and writes the F word basically 7 times in a row without any spaces. And I just thought it was a weird thing to have in common with The Shining. Having this writer, write the same phrase or word over and over and over again on a typewriter. And that's something else I gotta wonder too, what does this movie look like today? If I really hope this doesn't happen, but let's say someone gets the bright idea to remake this movie. How do they encounter some of the different technological changes that have occurred since the making of this version of the movie? With the snowstorms taking the power out, with the typewriters being used, maybe they'd use computers instead, maybe they would still just be finicky as hell and use a typewriter anyway. Who knows? The other thing that I noticed from a Stanley Kubrick movie was with A Clockwork Orange, you had Alex, the main character, your humble narrator, if you will, and he was the villain in this case, even though you start to build a little bit of sympathy towards him, but not a whole heap, just a tiny bit. But he's fascinated with Beethoven. And in this movie, Annie Wilkes is fascinated with Liberace. And I had to feel a little bit smart when I saw Liberace's portrait, and he wasn't even named yet, and I thought, oh god, that's Liberace. And to that credit, that's because I went to the Wax Museum in Vegas last year, but I digress. So this movie also had a Stanley Kubrick-esque element of where the villain was obsessed with classical music. And I guess they were trying to go for that she was a bit artsy, even though she was a maniac and fucking crazy. Who knows? So my final thoughts on this movie are basically about the last 5 to 10 minutes, the climax, if you will, of the movie, and it's this encounter between who else? Paul Sheldon and Annie Wilkes, the two characters we've been seeing fight each other for the last hour 45, 2 hours or so at this point, and James Caan ends up taking his typewriter and banging her in the head with it. And I just gotta say, wow, that that's blunt. Oh, man. I start to notice too that James Caan starts to get a little crazy himself in this role because throughout he's always the saner of the two, but that's not saying much. And he starts to descend into this madness as he tries to play her game and try to outwit her. And you start to see he's really starting to lose his marbles too. But the main difference between him and Annie Wilkes is that he's able to write out his new pieces of work and somehow manifest all of his delusions into a piece of fiction. Annie Wilkes only has his pieces of work to really chew through. So he ends up winning in this case, and it probably also helps that he realizes to bang her on the head with a typewriter because she will just not die otherwise. And this movie, I felt I liked more than The Silence of the Lambs. I did. I I really enjoyed the chemistry between James Caan and Kathy Bates. Kathy Bates does a phenomenal job at playing this lady that's simultaneously sweet as could be and scary as hell. And I thought James Caan was a good fit for this character of Paul Sheldon. He was believable enough as a human being that you didn't think that he was really that out of place with what he was thinking, and you felt sorry for him. But he was tough enough that you knew you didn't have to, provide any ammunition or provide him any artillery. He could fight his own battles, in other words. And I thought the chemistry between the two characters was great, and the supporting roles by Lauren Bacall and the sheriff that is in this movie, I thought they were fantastic and really added that little bit of flavor that was not captured by the two main characters. And even though this movie is not technically in the top 250 on the IMDb, it actually has a fairly high rating of about 7.8 as of when I checked last. And I would say that this is a that I like this movie more than Fatal Attraction as well. So when I compile my final list, I would probably have, as of this filming, the Clockwork Orange is still number one. Um, Misery would be number two. Silence of the Lambs would be number three, and then Fatal Attraction would be number four. Now, I just rewatched The Dark Knight today, and I'm going to be doing a review of that in the near future, and you will see where that ends up on my list. And I'm feeling pretty good about this one. And though I wrote more notes on this movie, I feel like most of the notes that I have on The Dark Knight are positive, but I'll go into that in a further video into more detail on that. So I'll see y'all next time, and y'all have a great day now. All right, bye.